Hello, welcome to this mini lecture on key issues in energy, energy regulation, as they are relevant to our upcoming tour of the Tesla Fremont factory. Just as a caveat here, of course, this is intended to be not a comprehensive survey, but rather a pointing out of some things that will be relevant to our discussion of climate change later on in this course. All right, I have a few slides to show. Hopefully this won't take more than 10 minutes. And if you can at all, I hope that you'll be able to watch this before our tour. Okay, all right. So key issues in energy law for the Tesla factory tour. There we go. And the broader question this is designed to address is, what is the relevance of electric vehicles to the problem of climate change, which is, of course, why there's so much interest in electric vehicle technology. And before I get into that, actually, I want to spend just 1 minute on this broader issue of climate change and just to recap briefly the sort of broader fundamental understanding that the greenhouse effect is at the core of the climate change problem. This is a diagram possibly that many of you have seen previously. Climate change is the result of essentially increased concentration of greenhouse gases, specifically and most importantly, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because carbon dioxide absorbs and helps to heat up the planet's surface and atmosphere. It retains heat just as a greenhouse would. And that creates problems for us because not only does it increase global temperatures, but it contributes to sea level rise, both by thermal expansion of water in the ocean, but maybe more dramatic and concerning through the melting of the polar ice caps. And then, of course, it changes weather patterns, which is really what we see maybe most visibly as a sign of climate change, the droughts, the severe storms, hurricanes, etc. Down here, I also have a few of the major secondary effects: health, agriculture, food production, forests, viability, water resources, droughts and severe storms, coastal impacts, and of course, effects on the biosphere. Right? So this is something that I will come back to in a little bit more detail, but this is also designed to just remind you and hopefully just to cue you in on some of the importance of this broader problem. All right, so where then do electric vehicles fit in? And they come in precisely at the issue of energy. Energy production and really our reliance on fossil fuels as a source of energy in our modern economy is really the main culprit for the problem of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore climate change. And that is just a simple effect of our overall reliance on energy for food production, industrial processes, modern machinery, and electrification, globalization. Think about the internet and think about, for example, Bitcoin mining, which has been incredibly energy intensive. And then transportation, of course. Transportation is where electric vehicles fit in. So what is then the challenge here of using electricity to replace fossil fuel use, right? And the mantra that you usually hear that is sort of foremost the catchphrase, the slogan for why we should move from gasoline-powered internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles is because electricity does not produce carbon dioxide, and therefore we can decarbonize transportation. Well, that's not entirely true. And here's really sort of the caveats that I want to start introducing before I then come to the electric power grid. And that is, there are real challenges in using electricity to replace fossil fuels as a transportation source of transportation energy. And first of all, and I'll come to this in just a little bit more detail in just a second, electricity in itself is not a source of energy, at least not the way we use it. It's used primarily to transmit energy. And the secondary problem that arises is that electricity, at least not as a practical matter, at least not using the technologies that we currently have, cannot be readily stored. So, for example, when we quote unquote store electricity in batteries, that's really not storing electricity. That's converting electricity into chemical energy, into chemical bonds, because when you charge a battery, you convert one set of chemicals in the battery into another form that can then release energy when you discharge the battery, right? But that also means that if electricity itself is not a source of energy for us, because it is so transient, because it can't be stored, where does it then come from? It has to come from somewhere, and ordinarily it would come from fossil fuel power plants, but that of course then also opens up the possibility for us to rely on solar panels, wind turbines, other forms of clean energy to generate power energy that then gets transmitted in the form of electricity for whatever ultimate uses we want to make of it. One final caveat and challenge here is that whenever there's a change in the form of energy, there's a loss of energy. There's inefficiency associated with it, right? And so these diagrams here are just designed to illustrate what I've just said here. Where actually energy is generated, even now still is in the form or comes from fossil fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal. Coal has been shrinking steadily, really important trend. And renewables, of course, have been growing, but even now, they still only constitute about 12% of the United States supply of power, but clearly growing. So it's coming from somewhere. And while I'll come back to this, but it means that if we draw power from the grid, a lot of that energy is from fossil fuel combustion, right? So that is one thing here to consider. And this is here then also, this is then how energy is produced and then made use of. And what you can see here is that its end target or end sectors can be split up sort of into thirds approximately, or quarters really the way this is put is transportation, industrial, and building sort of uses, residential, commercial buildings. And a fourth sector is into electricity, into power generation. But power generation in itself is really not an end use. It's really just an intermediary towards a final user, final use, because electricity, as I mentioned, really is just a medium of transferring the energy that's been generated in a power station, in the solar panel, and the wind turbine to the end users, but not in the form of heat but in the form of electricity. And here's one key thing to note, that as I mentioned, anytime you change energy form, there is a loss. And it turns out that the electric grid loses about 2/3 of the energy that's produced in the transmission process, right? So it's really quite important. 60-something percent, 65% of energy is lost in transmitting it. Now, ultimately, there are ways to reduce the losses, but loss is inevitable. And again, keep in mind, this is not an argument here for why we shouldn't electrify, but rather a challenge that has to be considered in looking to electricity and the grid here as an alternative to fossil fuel use, right? We have to move to away from fossil fuels, but this is not as easy. Maybe this is what I'm trying to point. This is not as easy as it might sound like otherwise. Now, the final sort of set of points that I want to explain here is that the way electricity is transmitted from the source of power, the power station, the solar panel, the wind turbine, to the end user, our home, the industrial plant, is through the grid, right? This is what you see in the form of the high voltage line, also the residential power lines. And one way to characterize this, it's really an interconnected whole. It's a machine that delivers energy in the form of electricity from the producer to the consumer. I describe it as a machine, even though you might not think of it. You see the wires, the sort of static, stationary structures, but they all work together to transmit power. And the reason why machine is a good metaphor or good description is that they're all interconnected, and that failure in one portion of the grid can lead to failure of the entire system, right? This is just a brief diagram here of how the grid is structured. Producer in number one to which then transmits electricity via high voltage transmission lines across long distances to then some sort of station and a local distributor, and then ultimately to the end user here. This is a map that shows you where all those transmission lines are, the high voltage transmission lines. And another map here that shows those transmission lines within the San Francisco Bay Area, including, of course, where we are in Santa Clara. Now, there are three sets of physical entities that are involved here. One is the power generator, what I mentioned already, the power station, the wind turbine. Then there's the transmission infrastructure, what is so highly visible, right? When you drive on the freeway, you see these large transmission towers. And then the local distribution companies, PG&E for our area, Southern California Edison for further down in the south. These are the entities that take the electricity from those high voltage transmission lines and then distribute it through their own lines to the ultimate customer. The transmission infrastructure that sort of transport energy from the generator to the local distribution company, to PG&E, for example, are here in California, the California Independent Systems Operator. They own that transmission infrastructure. And I'll come this is here as to why they're important. Basically, the country is divided up into these regional transmission organizations. Here are just a few. California, as you can see in this diagram, the California ISO doesn't literally cover all of California, but most of California. And they're essentially responsible for supplying the state with the necessary electric power, buying it from the power producers, and then delivering it to the regional distributors, local distributors that then send it on forward to the particular users. This is just a map of where the private electric utility companies operate. You can see PG&E has a huge service area. And I wanted to show briefly this website of the California Independent Systems Operator. It is an interesting website. If you've never visited them, I would encourage you to do so because it's really quite instructive. I have to find where my there we go. All right. So this is a chart here that the California Independent Systems Operator makes publicly available. Why is it significant? You can see here in real time how power is being used within California. So this directly tracks, when we wake up in the morning, as power use gets ramped up as we go to work and all these activities. And then when we come home, of course, everybody turns on their TV, the lights starts, there's stoves, there's also other things. And that's usually when power spikes, right? During periods of heat when everybody has to use, or when people use air conditioning, for example, that creates problems. Now, the reason why this is significant and what one of the most important functions of the Independent Systems Operator is to balance the supply of power that goes into the grid with the demand by customers. As I mentioned, electricity cannot be stored, and so it has to be used at the same time when it is being generated. So supply always has to be balanced with demand. And when that is out of whack, that's when there are problems and the whole system can break down, right? So it's really quite an important function that is then centralized within the Independent Systems Operator. There are, of course, regulators involved that supervise at the federal level. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And at the state level, it's the Public Utilities Commissions, including the California PUC. Now, there is a sort of a semi-private organization, semi-public organization, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, which sort of has a national perspective and coordinated function with several or 6 regional electric reliability organizations. Why are they important? Well, it turns out, of course, as you can see here, the WECC operates across more than just California. And so the California ISO really has to work together with other systems operators to get power, to have power transmitted through other systems transmission lines in order to get to California, right? And so that then creates, of course, questions of coordination and synchronization of and standard practices, etc. Suffice it to say that it's really quite an important function to maintain the stability, in order to maintain the stability of the system, the grid, and therefore a big concern because most of us as consumers never see these things. But there's this whole machinery operating in the background that that is, of course, critical part of our sort of economic infrastructure. And ultimately here then, so let me leave sort of the grid here then with this last sort of observation that this is an intricate machine that requires a lot of care. But it also has, I think, at least one consequence related to electric vehicles, and then another one that ties back to an issue that I mentioned earlier, that is to batteries. The first one here is really the second of these points here. What is an environmentally related issue then for EVs? Well, if electric vehicles have to get their power from the power grid, that means that the reliability issues that are inherently a concern with the grid transfer onto electric vehicle use, of course. It also means that in order to access electricity, you have to have some access to the infrastructure of the grid. And as you know, of course, we see this concretely in terms of the availability of charging stations, not only how many there are, but simply access to them in rural and remote areas of the country, right? And that means development, building of transmission towers, of electric power lines. All those have environmental consequences. The other one is that when we use electricity in vehicles, it has to be stored, and it's not stored in the form of electricity per se. It's stored in the form of chemical bonds and in the chemicals that are found in batteries. And so those chemicals have to be produced, and those batteries have to be produced in some fashion, which then, of course, raises all sorts of traditional manufacturing issues, raw material mining issues, and the associated environmental concerns that come with them, right? So these are really 2 sets of significant environmental issues that come with the shift here to electric vehicles. You know, they have not been ignored, but they certainly have not been front and center when the media and when the public discussions about electrification and the transition of our economy from fossil fuel driven vehicles to electric vehicles, right? So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to seeing everybody either at the factory or back in class.